I have to say, Mr. Trump's speech was shorter than I expected, but of course, it started with him speaking about the China virus, and then went on to speak about his achievements. So I guess, Joyce, I'll turn to you first. What did you think of the speech?
It was a shorter speech. It was extraordinary that, this is a guy who thrives on having a live audience, but had to do it from the White House virtually. I thought few interesting things touting his biggest foreign policy accomplishment, the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain peace deal. So that was, we heard it, from the ambassador introducing him and from the president himself multiple times. The other points that he raised looked so much like a campaign speech. He's talking about releasing a vaccine and ending the pandemic. We know that the health departments and CDC in the US speak of a different timeline, and this vaccine is purely, going to be distributed in the US. The anti-China rhetoric, I think, is to be expected. We are in a election year. We're almost 40 days away from US election on November 3rd. He also said that ISIS was 100% obliterated in Iraq and Syria. On the surface of it, sure, but I think few experts would disagree with this, would point to ISIS resurgence. And of course, he repeated his line that Qasem Soleimani, calling him the biggest terrorist, has been killed. That comes, less than 24 hours after we heard from Iranian Foreign Minister yesterday, Jawad Zarif, in New York, saying that retribution for the killing of Soleimani is still, will be done. Revenge attack will be held. So these are the main points. It's very much a campaign speech, but the touting of his biggest foreign policy accomplishment, the UAE-Israel peace agreement, was all over this address.
Yeah, he spoke about the Abraham Accords. Also, the U.S. permanent representative at the UN started introducing him by speaking about that, saying that he's brought peace. Willy, you were in Washington with Joyce for that last week. So he seemed very confident in his address now, saying that many other Middle Eastern countries will follow suit, without giving us more details. What did you make of what he said about the Middle East?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, and to be fair to him, all of the experts that Joyce and I have been speaking to over the last few days have all really hinted that in the next 5 years, most of the kind of dominoes, if you will fall, and most of the states in the region will probably have some sort of peace deal with Israel. One of the things, as you mentioned, the Abraham Accords in Washington, that whole event could not be farther removed from what we're witnessing today at the United Nations General Assembly, where you had hundreds of people obviously in person attending. The cutaways that you're seeing from the UN General Assembly are just remarkable in the emptiness that you're witnessing. And certainly here on the streets, it's truly surreal to see, because there really is just not a soul in sight almost. It's as if the police they've still erected a barricade on First Avenue, but it's almost just out of muscle memory because there's no one there.
Yeah, it's incredible to see that on the 75th anniversary, this was supposed to be a very big year for the UN. It's 10 years before the Sustainable Development Goals are meant to be reached by the world. So this was really supposed to be a time to come together. And of course, COVID-19 has changed the realities for everybody, including, of course, for New Yorkers, who usually resent this week because it clogs up their streets and makes life very difficult. But Willy, you've also been speaking to hotels that usually make a lot of their income during this 1 week, where delegations from 193 countries come. And this year, of course, occupancy is really down, and some have even shut. Tell us about that, Will.
Yeah, there is no question that New York City is hurting, and it's hurting quite badly. It has, at the peak it was seeing over 6,000 cases a day, hundreds of deaths. There have been more than 200,000 cases reported just in New York City alone. The number of deaths around 23,000. I would say that this is a city that is both scarred and traumatized by transpired over the last few months. And walking through the streets, it's palpable, that tension. And I spoke with Penny Abiwardena, who is the New York City Commissioner for International Affairs. And she said that, they wanted the world to be here. They wanted this to be a big event, but they can't because the pandemic is quite simply not over. They're still struggling to survive. They're only at phase 4. Restaurants are open, but only for outdoor dining. And hotels, still about 65% of them closed.
Willy, of course, I mean, as you said, New York is going through what many cities around the world are going through, but President Trump gave an optimistic impression saying that next year things will be great. It'll be one of the best years. Of course, this may be his last year delivering the address as president of the United States, with the elections coming up in November, or we may have 4 more years. Joyce, how much of the speech was, a campaign stuff or not? I mean, if this was, as you said, in person, and if he was physically, around in New York, we may have had a different sentiment. Do you think that elections were part of what he was trying to get at and saying that next year will be a great year?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think his whole messaging on the election is this pandemic that you've seen, this 200,000 deaths now in the US is temporary, and we will be over that crisis soon. The problem is this is not resonating with the American public. When you see, head-to-head Joe Biden and Donald Trump on handling of the pandemic, this is Joe Biden's biggest advantage. Also, I'm not sure how many American audiences were listening to President Trump from the United Nations General Assembly. He knows it himself. He will be campaigning today. He campaigned yesterday, and that's one main reason he didn't go there. I mean, this is a president who campaigns 24/7. We've seen it, his first speech, second speech, third speech, and today. So it remains to be seen if this has any effect on moving the needle in the election, but I personally doubt it.
Thanks, Joyce. Well, here in Abu Dhabi, in the newsroom in Abu Dhabi, in Washington, Joyce, Willy in New York, and the rest of the team will continue to be covering both the UN General Assembly this week and the coming week, but of course also following where the US elections will take us in the coming weeks. Thank you for joining me, Joyce and Willy, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. Keep following us on thenational.ae.